Welcome to Stories with Facts.
Okay.
Let's rewind the clock back to October 2023. You brought this really interesting stack of articles and analyses about a month that kind of turned everything upside down in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what we want to do today is kind of untangle what happened and why it still matters now, all this time later, and what it tells us about this long and really complex situation. Before we get into the events themselves, let's quickly just like map out who the main players were. We've got Israel with a strong military and a long history of conflict in the region, and then there's Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, and of course you can't forget the international community, the U.S., the UN, various Middle Eastern nations, all trying to figure out how to handle this incredibly tense situation.
Right. And what's really important to remember is that each of these players came into October 2023 with their own baggage,
Right.
their own motivations, their own views on the decades of conflict that had already happened. And those viewpoints often really clashed, which made it practically impossible to find any kind of common ground, let alone a path to peace.
It's like everyone's looking at the same map, but they're seeing something totally different.
Exactly.
And then on October 7th, 2023, something happens that just throws everything into chaos. The Hamas attack.
It was a Saturday morning in Israel, just a regular day, and then all of a sudden, air raid sirens are going off everywhere, warning about incoming rockets. But this wasn't like anything Israel had ever experienced before Hamas launched this multi-pronged assault, like something on a scale and with a level of coordination that was just unprecedented. They combined these huge rocket barrages with ground infiltrations, surprise attacks, hitting Israeli towns, military installations all along the Gaza border.
And the sources we have really detail the just devastating toll of that day. Over 1,200 Israelis killed, more than 250 taken hostage. And it wasn't just soldiers, civilians too. The sheer scale of it, the coordination it must have taken to pull this off, it's just mind-blowing.
And this wasn't just some random impulsive act of violence either.
Hey,
The
dude.
sources point to a really meticulously planned operation, something Hamas had been preparing for who knows how long. Their goal seems to have been to inflict as much damage as they could, both physical and psychological, to just completely shock Israel to its core.
And they shock the world. Can
Right.
you imagine the ripple effect of this attack, especially in a region that was already so volatile?
The world was just watching in horror as the situation spiraled. Israel declared a state of war and vowed to retaliate with everything they had. Within hours, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, launched airstrikes targeting Hamas infrastructure throughout Gaza, weapons depots, command centers, tunnel networks, anything and everything connected to Hamas's military capabilities.
And Israel started mobilizing for something much bigger, right? Calling up reservists, securing border areas. It sounds like they were gearing up for a major confrontation.
Oh, absolutely. This was not going to be a small-scale thing. And it all happened so fast. The situation escalated at a terrifying pace. The days that followed were just back and forth, constant intensifying violence. Israel kept up these relentless airstrikes while Hamas retaliated with thousands of rockets aimed at Israeli cities. Some of them even reached Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, wow.
Yeah.
That's not just any city. It holds such immense religious and historical significance for both Israelis and Palestinians, which makes it a particularly sensitive target.
Exactly. The fact that Hamas was able to hit Jerusalem with their rockets shows just how audacious and calculated their offensive was. And while Israel's Iron Dome system was able to intercept a lot of those rockets, the sheer volume was just overwhelming at times, and it led to casualties and a lot of damage in Israel.
So both sides are digging in. The violence is escalating. And the human cost is starting to become terrifyingly clear. I'm thinking especially about the situation in Gaza. The sources paint a pretty grim picture of what was happening there in those first couple of weeks.
Well, you have to remember that Gaza is this densely populated strip of land, and imagine it constantly being bombarded by Israeli airstrikes. Residential buildings, hospitals, schools, nothing was spared. The UN estimated that hundreds of thousands of Gazans were displaced, fleeing their homes, trying to find refuge in shelters that were already overflowing.
Yeah, and on top of all that, the sources talk about essential services like electricity, water, medical care, all becoming incredibly scarce.
Right, because the constant bombardments combined with Israel's pre-existing blockade of the Gaza Strip created a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions. People were trapped struggling to survive with hardly any supplies and very limited access to even the most basic necessities.
It's hard to even fathom the level of fear and desperation they must have been feeling.
It was a truly dire situation. And tragically, as October went on, that humanitarian crisis only got worse.
So while all of this was happening, What was the international community doing? Were they just standing by and watching this unfold?
Well, there were calls for a ceasefire from various parties, the UN, the EU, even some Middle Eastern nations, but those calls were largely ignored.
Why? What was stopping them from taking more decisive action?
It was complicated, but geopolitical divisions definitely played a major role. The United States, for example, reaffirmed its unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself, while also urging restraint to try and minimize civilian casualties.
But the U.S. has a long history of supporting Israel both politically and militarily, so their stance wasn't surprising.
Right, but then you have countries like Iran and Turkey who strongly condemned Israel's military response, seeing it as disproportionate force. They voiced their support for the Palestinian cause and criticized what they saw as Western bias.
So the international community was deeply divided on how to approach this conflict.
Absolutely, and that lack of a unified response made it incredibly difficult to put any real pressure on either side to de-escalate the situation.
It seems like even with all the calls for peace, neither Israel nor Hamas was willing to back down. It feels like we're heading towards something even worse.
And you'd be right to feel that way.
Hmm.
As we move into the third week of October, the situation took another dark turn. Israel started signaling that they were going to launch a ground invasion of Gaza.
Wow. This is a major escalation, a turning point in the conflict.
Right.
What led to this decision by Israel?
From Israel's perspective, the airstrikes weren't achieving their goals. They wanted to completely dismantle Hamas's capabilities and secure the release of the hostages taken on October 7th. They believed a ground invasion was the only way to accomplish those objectives.
So by this point, Israel is actively preparing for a large-scale invasion. The sources describe troops and armored units massing near the Gaza border, military drills, reconnaissance missions. It was a buildup that was impossible to ignore.
The whole world was watching, holding its breath. And this development sent shockwaves through the international community.
Especially considering what a ground invasion could mean in a densely populated area like Gaza. Were there concerns about civilian casualties, about the humanitarian situation getting even worse?
Oh, absolutely. Humanitarian agencies issued urgent warnings that a ground invasion would almost certainly lead to a massive increase in civilian casualties, further exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation. But despite those warnings, Israel seemed determined to proceed.
So they believe this was the only way to neutralize Hamas and guarantee their own security. Okay, then what happens? Does the invasion actually take place?
Yes, on October 27th, 2023, Israel officially launched its ground invasion of Gaza.
October 27th, 2023. That date would become etched in the history of this conflict. Can you describe what that invasion looked like? What was Israel's strategy?
Israel deployed infantry armored divisions, special forces units. They went deep into Gaza territory, focusing their efforts on Hamas's network of tunnels, their weapons stockpiles, their command centers.
We've heard a lot about these tunnel networks. What exactly are they, and why were they such a crucial target for Israel?
These tunnels are basically this complex maze running under Gaza. Hamas has spent years constructing them, using them to move fighters and weapons undetected, to launch surprise attacks, and to avoid Israeli surveillance. Israel saw them as a direct threat to their security, a key part of Hamas's ability to resist them. Destroying these tunnels became a top priority for the Israeli military.
So it was a major strategic objective. But the invasion wasn't only about tunnels. We also see intense urban warfare unfolding, Israeli forces clashing with Hamas fighters in densely populated areas.
Right. And as you can imagine, fighting in such a confined and heavily populated environment led to heavy casualties on both sides. But it was the civilians who paid the heaviest price.
The sources describe a horrifying turning point in the conflict. Civilian casualties skyrocketed. Gaza's healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. The whole region was plunged even deeper into despair.
Imagine Gaza, already reeling from weeks of airstrikes, now facing the full force of a ground invasion. Hospitals overflowing with the wounded, essential supplies running dangerously low, and the constant fear of violence hanging over everything. It was a truly catastrophic situation.
And the world couldn't ignore what was happening in Gaza. The sources mention massive protests erupting globally, people taking to the streets to condemn the violence and demand an end to the bloodshed.
Right. And the media played a crucial role in shaping global perceptions of the conflict. Western news outlets like the Jerusalem Post and the Indian Express provided extensive coverage, each with their own particular angle. But it wasn't just Western media. We also see perspectives from outlets like China.org and English.news, which offered different interpretations of the events unfolding.
So we have different narratives emerging, different ways of framing the conflict. How did this affect the way the international community responded?
It's a reminder that even in an age of instant global communication, the way information is filtered and presented can have a huge impact on how people understand and react to events, especially complex ones like this.
So by the end of October, the situation in Gaza was truly dire, a full-blown humanitarian crisis, fierce fighting on the ground, and a deeply divided international community seemingly unable to find a way forward. Were there any attempts made during this period to broker a ceasefire to bring an end to the violence?
There were multiple attempts to initiate a ceasefire, but unfortunately none of them were successful.
Why not? What were the main obstacles standing in the way of peace?
A major factor was the deep mistrust between Israel and Hamas. Both sides had experienced significant losses, and neither was willing to make concessions without guarantees that the other would honor any agreement.
It seems both sides were so entrenched in their positions, so unwilling to budge, that finding any middle ground seemed impossible.
Exactly. And to make matters even more complicated, the international community's inability to present a united front hindered their attempts to effectively broker a ceasefire. With different countries having different interests and priorities, it was difficult to exert the coordinated pressure needed to bring Israel and Hamas to the negotiating table.
It sounds like the conflict had reached a stalemate. Neither side was willing to back down, and the international community, despite their efforts, couldn't find a way to break the deadlock. So as October 2023 drew to a close, this conflict remained a bloody, unresolved crisis, with no clear end in sight.
Unfortunately, that's an accurate assessment.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. From the initial attack to the escalating violence, from the ground invasion to the stalled ceasefire attempts, it's been a heavy and complex journey.
Indeed.
But we're not done yet. We still need to unpack the lasting impact of this pivotal month, examine the role of media coverage, and try to grapple with the bigger lessons we can all learn from this tragedy. So stay with us as we continue our deep dive into October 2023.
Welcome back.
We just walked through that really intense timeline of October 2023, the Hamas attack, the escalating violence, the ground invasion of Gaza, the humanitarian crisis. It's a lot to process. Where do we even begin to unpack the significance of it all?
I think what's really striking when you kind of zoom out and look at the big picture is how this one month just shattered so many assumptions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It exposed vulnerabilities on both sides, and it forced the international community to confront some uncomfortable truths.
Okay, break that down for us. What kind of assumptions were shattered?
Well, on the Israeli side, there was this prevailing belief that their intelligence agencies and their military superiority could prevent a large-scale attack like the one Hamas pulled off. October 7th proved that wrong in a very dramatic way.
It's like their sense of security, their belief in their own defenses was just completely shaken.
Exactly. And on the Palestinian side, particularly within certain segments of the international community, there was this assumption that Hamas was weakening, that they were becoming less of a threat. Their ability to plan and execute such a sophisticated and audacious attack really challenged that narrative.
So both sides made some pretty significant miscalculations. But how? Why?
That's where it gets really interesting. One of the key takeaways here is the danger of a lack of understanding, a failure to really grasp the motivations and the capabilities of the other side. Intelligence failures on Israel's part meant they underestimated how much planning and operational capacity Hamas actually had. At the same time, Hamas, perhaps blinded by their initial success, misjudged how fiercely Israel would respond and their own ability to withstand it.
So how do we avoid these kinds of miscalculations in the future?
Yeah.
It seems like it's about more than just gathering intelligence. It's about understanding the other side's perspective.
You've hit on a crucial point. Moving forward, there needs to be a commitment to more nuanced dialogue, not just between Israel and Hamas, but also within the international community itself. We have to move beyond those oversimplified narratives that paint one side as purely good and the other as purely evil. We need to acknowledge the complexities, the historical grievances, the traumas that fuel this conflict.
So it's about getting out of our echo chambers, being willing to engage with perspectives that challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly. And that includes listening to the voices of ordinary Israelis and Palestinians, their experiences, their fears, their hopes. These are essential pieces of the puzzle that often get lost in the broader geopolitical discussions.
That makes a lot of sense. More dialogue, more empathy, a willingness to see the humanity on all sides. It feels like a good place to start, but is it enough?
It's a necessary starting point, but it can't be the end point. We also need to recognize the powerful role that historical grievances and trauma play in perpetuating this conflict. Generations of both Israelis and Palestinians have grown up amidst violence and mistrust.
So how do we break that cycle? How do we move past decades of animosity and start building a more peaceful future?
That's the ultimate challenge, and there are no easy answers. One crucial step is to address the root causes of the conflict, not just the symptoms. This means engaging in difficult conversations about issues like land rights settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
Can you explain the right of return a bit further? I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with that concept.
Sure, it's a central demand for many Palestinians, and it's rooted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. They and their descendants assert their right to return to the homes and lands they were forced to flee. This issue is incredibly sensitive and complex with deep historical, legal, and emotional dimensions.
Okay, so addressing those root causes sounds critical, but it also sounds incredibly daunting. These are such sensitive and deeply divisive issues.
There's no denying that. But we can't shy away from these conversations, however difficult they may be. We need to acknowledge the historical injustices, the pain and suffering on both sides, and we need to be willing to explore creative solutions, ones that might involve compromise and a shift in perspective.
So we need to address the underlying issues, we need to foster more dialogue and understanding, and we need to always remember the human cost of this conflict. It's a tall order.
It is. But even in the midst of all the despair and destruction, there are glimmers of hope. There are individuals and organizations on both sides working tirelessly for peace and reconciliation.
Can you give us some examples? Who are these people? What kind of work are they doing?
There are grassroots activists, peace organizations, individuals who are literally putting their lives on the line to build bridges and challenge the status quo. They're organizing dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians, promoting cultural exchanges, and advocating for policies that support peaceful coexistence. They're working to heal the wounds of the past and build a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and security.
Their voices might not always make the headlines, but their work is so important. It's like they're saying, we refuse to give in to hate and violence. We believe a different future is possible.
That's exactly it. And their dedication, their unwavering commitment to peace, that's what gives me hope.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can still shine through.
Absolutely. And nurturing that spirit, supporting those who are actively working for peace is vital. If we want to see a different future for this region and for the world, we need to amplify their voices, learn from their efforts, and support their work in every way we can.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, both in terms of the complexities of this conflict and the potential paths toward peace.
I agree.
Let's take a pause here and come back for our final part in a moment. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into October 2023. We've explored the events themselves, the impact on both Israelis and Palestinians, the role of the international community, and the broader lessons we can learn from this conflict. But as we wrap things up, I kind of want to shift gears a bit and leave our listeners with something to really chew on, something to ponder.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
So imagine just for a moment that we could step back in time, back to those tense days leading up to the Hamas attack on October 7th. Knowing everything we know now about the devastation that happened, about all the miscalculations and the missed opportunities, what could have been done differently? What actions could have been taken by whom to potentially prevent this tragedy?
That is a powerful question, and it's one that'll keep being debated for years to come, not just by historians and policymakers, but by everyday people trying to make sense of how we got here.
Exactly. And I know there's no easy answers, no guarantees, but asking this question, exploring the what ifs, it just feels important. Because if we can pinpoint those potential points of intervention, those moments where the course of history could have maybe been altered, then maybe, just maybe, we can actually learn from them. Yeah. We can use that knowledge to work towards a future where these kinds of horrific conflicts are prevented, not just reacted to.
I couldn't agree more. This question really pushes us beyond just pointing fingers or placing blame. It forces us to think critically, to untangle that web of factors that led to this crisis, and to consider, even if it's just hypothetically, the possibility that things could have played out differently.
So let's play that out a bit. What are some of those what ifs that jump out at you?
Well, what if there had been more open communication between Israel and Hamas, even indirectly through someone else? A greater willingness to at least acknowledge the other side's grievances, to explore even the smallest chance of compromise? Or what if the international community had taken a more proactive role? What if they'd worked harder to address those underlying issues? You know, the settlements, the status of Jerusalem, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza before things reached a breaking point.
It's all hypothetical. Of course, we can't go back and change the past. But I think there's value in exploring those alternate paths and in imagining choices that could have led to a different outcome.
Absolutely. By engaging with those what ifs, we can start to recognize potential warning signs, understand how crucial early intervention is, and maybe just maybe spark some creative thinking about how to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with that challenge. As you go about your day, as you come across news about conflicts and division in the world, take a moment to reflect on this question. What could have been done differently? Because within those reflections, in those moments of critical thinking and empathy, that's where we might find the seeds of a more peaceful and just world.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into October 2023.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time on Stories with Facts.